Welcome to Veiled Histories, where we uncover the stories hidden in the margins of the past. Today, we're digging into a story that was deliberately buried for decades, an experiment so infamous, its own creators called it a monster. Picture this. It's 1939. We're at the Iowa Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home. And inside these walls, a radical and frankly, a dangerous idea was about to be tested on the children who lived there. Some of the most vulnerable people imaginable. So here's the core idea from a speech pathologist named Wendell Johnson. He called it the diagnosogenic theory, which is a fancy way of saying he believed stuttering wasn't a physical problem. Nope, he was convinced it was a learned behavior, basically an anxiety disorder. He argued that all kids stumble over their words. That's normal. The problem, he said, starts when an anxious parent hears those normal stumbles and labels it stuttering. That label makes the child self-conscious and tense, and that anxiety is what turns a normal speech hiccup into a full-blown chronic stutter. To prove this theory, Johnson and his graduate student, Mary Tudor, came up with an experiment. And their subjects? 22 kids from the orphanage, from as young as 5 years old. These children were chosen without their knowledge and, of course, without any kind of consent. They were about to become unwilling participants in an experiment that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The cruelty here was just baked right into the design. The kids were split into 4 groups. Some who already stuttered were either told they were fine or criticized. But here's where it gets really dark. They took children with perfectly normal speech. One group was praised for how well they spoke. But Group 2A, that group consisted of 6 normally fluent kids who were about to be systematically convinced that they were broken. For 4 solid months, Mary Tudor met with these children and just drilled this into them. She told them that their normal pauses, their normal hesitations, were signs of a serious problem. She actually instructed them, use your willpower, do anything to keep from stuttering. The orphanage staff was even told to reinforce this awful label. It was a complete psychological assault on these kids. So after the experiment was over, Tudor wrote up her findings in her master's thesis, and then nothing. Crickets. The thesis was just filed away in the University of Iowa library. It was never published. The children, now saddled with this new, confusing anxiety about speaking, were just left to deal with it. Their experience was completely buried, a secret kept for more than half a century. For 62 years, this story stayed hidden. Then, in 2001, a journalist literally stumbled upon the thesis. His report blew the story of the monster study wide open, and the public was, understandably, horrified. The University of Iowa eventually issued a formal apology, calling the experiment regrettable. But for the survivors, regrettable didn't even begin to cover it. The consequences for those kids in Group 2A were devastating and permanent. Survivors talked about avoiding speaking in class, turning down jobs, pulling away from friends, all because talking felt dangerous. And the most heartbreaking part? Many of them only understood where this deep-seated fear came from after reading the news in 2001. Can you imagine finding out that a lifelong anxiety wasn't your fault, but the result of a secret experiment someone performed on you as a child? In 2007, the state of Iowa agreed to pay a settlement. Now, officially, they denied any legal liability, but let's be real. This payment was a clear acknowledgement of the immense, lasting psychological damage that was inflicted on these children who were supposed to be under the state's protection. You know, the fact that these stories were buried for so long is exactly why we created Veiled Histories. We believe these forgotten chapters need to be brought into the light. If you agree, and if you think this work is important, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It really does help us continue to bring these stories to you. So, the study was an ethical nightmare. The harm was real, and it was unforgivable. There is no debate there. But here's a crucial question that complicates the story we all think we know. Beyond the moral horror, did the experiment actually succeed on a scientific level? Did it really prove you could create a stutter just through negative labeling? In 2002, 2 academics, Nicolene Ambrose and Ehud Yairi, decided to do what no one had done before. They went back to Mary Tudor's original 60-year-old thesis. They didn't rely on the media reports or the legend of the monster study. No, they went straight to the source and reanalyzed the raw data that Tudor herself had collected. And what they found? It pretty much turns the whole story on its head. This table shows fluency ratings from independent judges. And remember, on this scale, a higher score means more fluent speech. So look at Group 2A, the kids who were told they were stutters. Their average fluency rating actually improved a little bit. In fact, if you look across all the groups, there were no big significant changes. The experiment, judged on its own terms, was a total failure. Ambrose and Yeri's conclusion was unambiguous. Based on the study's own data, the actual numbers, the experiment did not work. It failed to prove Johnson's theory. The whole legend that scientists successfully created stutterers was, well, it was a myth. And when you dig into the individual data, the story gets even stranger. This chart shows the speech patterns for one child in that negative group. The solid line, that's a key sign of stuttering. At the start, she showed a pretty high rate of it. By the end of the study, it had plummeted. It basically disappeared. The experiment had the exact opposite of its intended effect on her. And this wasn't just a one-off. Across the group, the data was a mess. These solid lines, which represent stuttering-like behaviors, are mostly flat or even going down. But the dash lines, which show things like pausing, they're going up. What does that tell us? The children weren't stuttering more, they were just becoming more hesitant, more anxious, and more afraid to speak at all. So why were the results so messy? Well, because the experiment itself was a scientific disaster. Ambrose and Yeri pointed out a ton of fatal flaws. For one, some of the normal speakers, like that child we just saw, probably already stuttered a bit. The method was inconsistent, kids got different numbers of sessions, tutor never did any real statistical analysis to prove her results meant anything, and of course, since she knew which group each kid was in, the risk of investigator bias was through the roof. And this brings us to the real and maybe even more chilling conclusion. The popular story that scientists proved they could create stutterers isn't true. The experiment was a scientific failure, but that failure doesn't make it any less monstrous. In fact, it sharpens the focus on where the real monstrosity was all along. This quote from that reanalysis is so important. Even in Mary Tudor's own final notes, she doesn't claim to have created stuttering. She wrote that the children became reluctant to speak, more self-conscious, shy and embarrassed. They stopped talking freely. They started covering their mouths. The independent judges never once used the word stuttering to describe what happened to those kids by the end of the study. And that's the real harm. The monster study didn't succeed in creating a speech disorder. It succeeded in terrorizing children. It weaponized shame and anxiety to convince healthy kids that something was fundamentally wrong with them. The monstrosity wasn't in the flawed data. It was in the complete and utter disregard for the humanity of its subjects. Now, unethical experiments like the monster study, along with even more horrific abuses like the Nazi experiments and the Tuskegee syphilis study, they did force the scientific community to create strict protections. The Nuremberg Code established that you absolutely need a person's informed consent. The Belmont Report laid out core ethical principles. And today, we have institutional review boards, or IRBs, whose entire job is to review research proposals to prevent these kinds of abuses from ever happening again. The monster study serves as a permanent chilling reminder. The desire to understand the world is a powerful force, but when that quest is divorced from empathy, it can become a monster itself. And it leaves us with an enduring question. How do we draw the line to ensure that our search for knowledge never again demands a child's humanity as its price?